It is a real and great pleasure and honor to have together with us not only a great film scholar and film historian, but also a person whose work influenced us very much through the years. Both Andre and myself, we discovered Kristin Thompson's. You don't hear me?
No.
So both Andre and myself discovered Mrs. Thompson's works and David Bordwell's works about the same time. I discovered them through Andre, and very soon after starting reading them, I think we became Thompsonian Bordwellians. Like we started to emulate or to copy as much as possible. We also included works in, of course, in many of our classes as mandatory lectures. So it's really like, I got used to it because there are already a couple of days since Kristin Thompson arrived, but it's like meeting, somebody from a fantasy or from an idea. Intellectual world. So we are very, very happy and honored on many levels to have you with us. So today, together with Andre, we will try to ask Kristin Thompson some questions related to all her work, which is tremendous and very consistent. And as you will be able to notice or to observe, very complex, so many directions, because she always seems to us not only a very curious absorber, let's say, of many different and various aspects related to cinema, but like a devourer, like somebody who wants to know, no matter what topic she chose. It seems that she always went like as much as possible in finding and discovering as many details from as many angles as possible about them. So I propose that we start the discussion. We made a plan of the discussion, so we will, each of us, we will follow some categories that we consider that are most important or the most relevant among Kristin Thompson's preoccupations. And in the first half of the discussion, it will be a discussion between us three, and in the last part, we will, of course, open the discussion to you, and if you have questions or anything to address, you will be welcome to. Okay? So thank you for being with us. Andrea, I pass you the mic.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about neoformalism, or as it was also called, historical poetics. This is the method. No, I don't think method is the right word. The approach that you and David Bordwell and other scholars, some of them connected with Madison, Wisconsin, you championed in the 1980s, and it seems to have been revolutionary at the time. And I wanted you to tell us a bit about what it was, what were some of the intellectual sources of this approach, and also what was so new about it in the context of 1980s and 1990s American, Anglo-American film studies.
Can you hear in the back? Okay. Well, I was getting my master's degree at the University of Iowa in the early 1970s. And it was a very small program. They only had 2 professors, and I had taken all the courses. So I went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where David had just gotten a teaching job. kept until he retired. And I knew when I went that I wanted to do my dissertation on Eisenstein's film Ivan the Terrible. But I have to say, I had no idea what I was going to do with it, and I had 2 years of courses to take. But at any rate, one day, David and I were in a bookshop, a used bookshop, and he gave me a little green book, which was called Four Russian Formalists. And it had essays by Victor Shklovsky, Boris Eichenbaum, and Yuri Timyanov. It was one of the first times that any of those authors had been translated into English. So it was obviously not something that was well known at that time in the country, the Russian formalists. But I read the book, and I thought it was extremely useful. I could see applying that to films, and that became the method that I used for analyzing Ivan the Terrible in my dissertation, which then subsequently was published by Princeton University Press. And I think for David and me, not only did Russian formalism provide various concepts like device and function that one could apply quite readily to film, even though they had been writing about literature. And it also led us to realize that one needed to look at any kind of artwork against the background, the context in which it was made. And so I think most of what we've been doing during all our careers has been looking at conventions, norms, sort of mainstream kinds of artworks in various countries, and looking at films that then departed from those norms. And since we were interested in filmmakers like Eisenstein, Ozu, Tati, Bresson, and so forth, obviously those were not people who were using the widespread conventions of cinema. But at the time, we were working on those various filmmakers. David is working on Carl Dreyer as well. His first focus on Carl Theodor Dreyer's work. We realized that really the background against which most of these directors were working was the classical Hollywood cinema, which was so ubiquitous at the time. Everybody in almost every country was seeing Hollywood films. And there was a big call during the 1970s among film scholars for someone to define the classical Hollywood cinema, because we didn't really know what it was. We kept using that term, but what was it? And we decided, well, nobody else seems to be working on this, so we decided to write a book on the classical Hollywood cinema. And that is very much a neo-formalist approach. That is, looking at the norms and then finding deviations from them. So that was the start of the classical Hollywood cinema. That was kind of the basic work that we had to do before we could go on and look at these other directors. Obviously, Ozu was someone who was very aware of the classical Hollywood cinema, and yet he devised his own system, his own style that was exactly opposed to it. So this was the basis for the rest of our careers, really, when we were looking at various directors and various movements in world cinema.
Did neo-formalism also involve a move away from interpretation, from hermeneutics as the main focus of film studies? Had it been until then a mainly hermeneutical discipline, a discipline concerned with interpretations, with what the works mean?
I think there was quite an emphasis on that. I mean, if you wrote about Ingmar Bergman, you were going to write about him as if he were a philosopher, and you try to figure out his vision of life and so on. And that was true of Antonioni and other art film directors in the period. It's not that we just gave up on interpretation, but it was not the main focus anymore. Analysis of style, of narrative structure, and of meaning as well. So we tried to broaden the way that we approach films.
Apart from the seminal work of the Russian formalists, what else? What other important sources did you have?
I think for me at least, and certainly for David, Noel Birch's theory of film practice was an absolutely vital work. And he was doing something that's rather comparable to what the Russian formalists were. And we did read Roland Barthes quite a bit during my graduate years. So those were two particularly important writers for me at least. And I had read a great deal of Andre Bazin when I was at Iowa. My teacher and professor there was Lily Andrew, who was very much involved with Bazin and wrote books on him and so forth. So those were the others, apart from Russian formalists, that I was most familiar with at that point.
Sorry, there is some colleague from the sound department, but I don't hear. Can you change the microphone so there's someone here?
Apare și dispare vocea asta.
So we should only use that one. Okay.
This is better? Okay. Is it volume?
So this is.
If I use it, it's better.
No, it's not better.
Very loud.
Not so close.
Sorry.
You have to open closer to my mouth.
And can you tell us how did neoformalism spread? Did it become fashionable? Is it still fashionable, or it's not? Or what happened between the 1970s and 1980s when you first articulated this approach till nowadays?
I don't think it became fashionable at all.
Never did, you say?
Really, I mean, other people used it. I think people who studied it at Wisconsin have used neoformalism, but at the time, semiotics and structuralism were the basic things that people were using to analyze film.
When you started out, semiotics and structuralism were dominating when you started out, but then afterwards?
Yes, I mean, that's why we were reading Roland Barthes, for example. And I think for most people, he was much more important than neoformalists.
Okay, but later, I mean, that was in the 1970s.
Yeah. I think there were some other people who were using neoformalism. I would say Edward Brannigan would be one. Some of our undergraduates were using it, but I don't think it was very widespread at all, which is perhaps unfortunate, but...
Why do you think that is? Does it have to do with reluctance to see art as art? I mean, there's a preference to treat it as a pretext, maybe, for talking about other things, or...
Yes, I think maybe it was an unfortunate choice to call it neoformalism because people immediately jumped to the idea of empty formalism, the idea that we were just talking about the artwork, art for art's sake, and that there was no connection to society for us, which is not at all the case. I mean, if you look at the classical Hollywood cinema, that's a book about capitalism, basically, and how capitalism worked in the film industry.
Yeah, maybe the other name for it, historical poetics, is better in this regards because it emphasizes the importance that you give to context, to contextualization.
I think that's probably true. I mean, it's too late now, but that term didn't come up in David's work until
2000s.
Yeah, well, or even the 90s. But yes, it was certainly well after I was working on my dissertation and then on the book that became Breaking the Glass Armor, which is a book of, I think, 12 close analyses of film. And I think they are the same thing, but it was just a rather unfortunate term, I think, in retrospect. But then, of course, you get more and more people wanting to talk about society and not about film art, and that's certainly what's happening today in the States with cultural studies, where we're looking at race and class and gender as represented in film, and not at all talking about aesthetics. And I think you could do both, but I think what we do is still looked upon as somehow naive and completely aesthetic oriented.
Andre?
Yeah. I would also like to include in the discussion a book that he wrote on classical Hollywood cinema together with David Bordwell and with James Taylor. This is a book that I think is the starter for a certain model that I could track in your whole work on history of film, in which together with them you address the evolution of Hollywood film from many perspectives, not only from an aesthetic perspective, but also from a technological perspective, from an economical perspective, from industrial perspective, from political perspective, all of them intermingled to describe, let's say, this evolution. I was curious to know a little bit about how you started already to say about your interest in the norm and in deviations. And can you tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book together, and how did you complete each other? I mean, not complete. Complement each other. Yeah.
Yes, we originally thought this was going to be a very short book. Another big one. And David and I were going to write it together, and it was originally going to be simply looking at a group of Hollywood films, a large group, and looking at the things they had in common. Things like shot reverse shot, things like the 180-degree rule. And then we thought, well, obviously those things don't come from nowhere. They are influenced by the different technologies that we used at the time. And they were influenced by what Janet called the mode of production. And she had just come to Madison as a graduate student at the time. And she was recognized as very smart. And she wrote a very excellent paper for one of her seminars on the film industry. So we thought, aha, here's someone that could come and do that for us, and we can talk about technology and techniques used in Hollywood films. So that's how we divided it up. We assigned each section separately. And so I was assigned the silent period, both technology and the techniques used, the devices used in films for editing and staging and so forth. And we came up with the idea of doing a random sample of 100 Hollywood films. We thought that would be enough to give us a good idea of what the norms were that they were using. So we generated that. We used a list of all the Hollywood films that had been made that was published in the Film Daily Yearbook, which is a trade paper publication. And so we got our numbers and we looked through the list, and the very first film that came up was Psycho. And we thought, that's not very random, that's a classic. But fortunately, the rest of the 100 films that came up were films mostly that we had never heard of. Very Lives of Reno, for example. So, 3 films in some cases, and so it really was a pretty random sampling of 100 films. And that became sort of the basic data from which we worked. But we also we went to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Library, went through the trade papers, we went through the Society for Information Technology Journal, everything we could find. It was a much bigger project than we had expected. We had no idea we were going to find all that data. People who had written about Hollywood up to that point had not done that. They had not looked in the technical journals or the industry papers. So we were finding more and more new material, and the book just grew tremendously from what we expected it to be. We thought maybe a couple hundred pages. It was 1,100 pages ultimately. So we did find a huge amount of material. And then that came out, and I think the people who have been calling for classical Hollywood cinema studies were not terribly pleased with it. I don't know why, but it was somewhat attacked in the film studies press. But I think it's become a classic in itself. It's still in print. It came out in 1985 and it's still in print. There was a conference held in Canada at University about the classical Hollywood cinema book called The Classical Hollywood Cinema in the 20th Century. People gave papers based around the book. So it's, I think it eventually became something that people recognized as very useful as a background for looking at all kinds of different cinema.
I just want briefly to add that tomorrow at 3 o'clock there will be a meeting, an informal meeting with Kristin Thompson in the bookshop Cartouche in France from Etarquina, and this is one of the books that you can find there. If you want to buy it, you will find it there, but also you can find it at the library of UNATC if you want to just borrow it.
Thank you.
You were saying that when it was initially published, the classical Hollywood cinema book came under attack. Could you perhaps elaborate a bit on that? What were the main lines of attack?
Frankly, I can't remember too much, but we originally submitted the book to Princeton University Press, and they sent it out to 2 outside readers, both of whom had been calling for books on classical Hollywood cinema to be published. We thought, oh, okay. So we suggested their names to our editor, and she sent them to these people, and they both turned it down. They said, this is not what we need. And I really don't know what their basis for saying that was, but that's why we ended up going to Routledge and Paul in London, and they took it right away. In fact, I don't think it was sent to outside readers. And they agreed to have that huge number of illustrations that we put in the book. They were just an ideal press. It was a fine experience. So from that period point on, we did quite well. And as I said, I think it was some of the screen people who were working in semiotics and structuralism, and for some reason had objections to this book. I think they had sort of preconception of what we would do, and possibly just as I say, it did catch on.
Well, I would go back a little bit to what you were describing in the beginning about the 100 films that you randomly selected as for research, for deeper research for the book. This is something that for me, when I started reading the history books, was very new in a way to like it's also happening in film history and introduction, of course, and in other books. To have, I was used with film historians to deal mostly with masterpieces. I mean, to pay attention mostly to the most, exquisite films in the history of cinema, and of course, many of those books were most of the times like presenting a succession of national schools, state schools, and very current and important auteurs and important films. And one of the shocks when it was not the first book that I read, but still, it's something that I can find in many of, like it's an approach we have. This was a big shock to see that so many of the films that are, described, analyzed, are mediums, are average films. It's something that probably even related to contemporary cinema, it made me realize that I am small. That these kind of films I will not spend time watching, although in the future they will be the norm of today. So they will be the let's say the smallest denominator in a way. So this is something that I was curious, for example, if this kind of approach already happened in maybe not either in film history before you or in other fields, literature or something, or it comes from your formalism?
Well, yeah, I think in some ways it did come from the Russian formalists, but I think historical writings on E-films and what we would consider fairly minor films was purely in the domain of fandom before we started. There were books about Laurel and Hardy and that sort of thing, but they were not written by people in the academy. They weren't scholars. They were fans who just liked doing this kind of research and watching these kinds of films and sharing them into film conventions of fans and sold prints of these films to each other and that kind of thing. But that's a very different sort of world, really. I think we probably were the first ones who decided that it was really important to look at a large group of just ordinary Hollywood films. And people have done that since. I think in looking at, for example, Bresson films, you could put him against ordinary French films, and it makes sense. So it's not just something that you get back to Hollywood.
You mentioned in your speech 2 days ago from the honoris causa ceremony in UNATC, you mentioned something about that famous meeting from the last part of the 70s in Brighton, when scholars met to watch together for a couple of days a very big amount of early films, which was the most unresearched, let's say, part of the history of cinema. And I was curious, but of course I imagine that they watched a lot of medium films, not only masterpieces. So I was curious because this was also a constant and fruitful preoccupation that you had for silent films and for that era, and for the first decades, the evolution of cinema. For example, in the film history introduction, as you already mentioned 2 days ago, you were the one that wrote mostly the first volume, the editions of the part that contains all the silent period evolution, but you also wrote books like Herlu, which goes to Hollywood, that deals only with the silent films made by the German. This sound is really bizarre. Can you hear us? Yeah, it really sounds crazy for all of us. So for you it's better, yeah? No. Can we do for something or we can do nothing to suffer? Okay, so I was saying that you deal with the silent cinema also in special dedicated books like Herlu, which goes to Hollywood, in which you very closely analyze the differences and similarities, thank you, the similarities between German style from the German period of British and also the American language and technology that we can see at work in these silent American films, but also we dedicated the whole book mainly to the distribution, to the way the American films were distributed between 1907 and 1974. So it was a constant preoccupation and from many, many different angles. And I was curious if going back to this random selection of films and to this attention paid to the let's say, to the norm and not to the exception. If it has to do something with research in silent cinema, where in the period when we started working, I think it was a very lively period for rediscovering silent cinema and assessing a lot of new films. We were also talking 2 days ago about the importance of Pordenone Film Festival. It's solely dedicated to silent films of Bologna. Did it have any influence on your approach or not at all?
The Brighton event?
For example,
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it happened in 1978, which is only a year after I got my degree, and I was not invited, so I was not in Brighton. But I got the reference books that were published as a result, the list of all the filmographies of all the films that they were shown. And then there was another conference in Perpignan, France, a few years later, and I did go to that and give a paper. And again, we were watching all the films they could find from Gaumont and Pathé and so forth. So we were seeing very ordinary films from, I would say it was certainly pre-1920. We saw some wonderful Fayard melodramas and 1 or 2 reels. That was, I think, another indication of just how much material survived for a start. And those were ordinary films. I mean, they were quite good ordinary films, but that was another exposure to just a large group of very early silent films. But I also, when I was an undergrad, when I took my first film course, I got very interested in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari and German Expressionism. And then in 1973, David was working on his dissertation and went to Eastman House to see some French Impressionist films, because that was the topic of his dissertation. So I went along and then I got to see quite a large number of French Impressionist films from the 1920s. And of course I knew about the Soviet montage movement, and I began to realize that there was this period in the 20s when 3 really major avant-garde film movements were happening. I got very interested in those. So yeah, from an early point I was interested in silent cinema and expecting to someday write a book on the 1920s avant-gardes, which has never happened, but they did end up in the chapters of film history and introduction. So that's something at least. But as to the book Exporting Entertainment, which came out in 1985, that was supposed to be the first chapter of my book on the 20s. And I was interested in finding out to what extent people in those countries were actually seeing American films. Were they influenced, or were they either imitating those films, or were they reacting against them with those avant-garde styles? So I spent some time just looking at government documents about exports of, X number of feet of negative film to England, or some sorts of things like that. And I discovered that American cinema was really becoming dominant almost around the world at a very early point, even just before World War I started. And I think people had not expected that it happened that early. I gave a talk in Australia on the subject, and I was saying that 90% of films shown in Australia by something like 1911 were American, and they were totally surprised. They expected that Australian films had been dominant, but no. So that was a book I felt was important, just to show that Hollywood cinema was really widely seen and influential. I'm sure many filmmakers in various countries were imitating Hollywood style, but as we know, there are those exceptions, the Bressons of this world, the Eisensteins, and so on. So, generally, yes, I was very interested in that period.
Just one going back before you said that when you enrolled for your PhD in Madison, you were really decided, really determined, you were that sad to research Ivan the Terrible. Could you tell us how had you decided that it has to be Ivan the Terrible?
Yes, there was a very major event on public television in the United States. I think it was 1970, possibly 1971. It was a series called Film Odyssey. It was put on public television. A fairly prominent film critic put together a series of films, and they were all the familiar classics, but I had not seen them. I mean, they were showing Rules of the Game. They showed M. They actually had Fritz Lang there to interview about it. He was still alive. They showed, I think it was Seven Samurai, Kurosawa, and just on and on, all these classic films, Bicycle Thieves, and Ivan the Terrible. And I was quite taken by that film. I was impressed, and I managed to see it on tape. They'd only shown the first part, but I saw both parts by the time I got my MA. And so I knew from that I wanted to look on that film more closely. That was, I think, for a lot of people in the United States, that was a real revelation, because we see that many big classic films at the same time.
I also was wondering a little about the process, because you already said that you, like for the books that you wrote in the 80s or in the 90s, so before the digital revolution, let's say, that made films and different other documents more easily accessible. So you worked, many of your books that are close analyses, some of them are using photograms from very specific photograms to illustrate certain demonstrations, let's say, that you have statistical demonstrations. So you already said that you worked with government documents and with accessing different magazines and technical books from the period. Can you tell us a little bit more about other instruments that you used in research? Because one of the particularities of your books and your history books is their preciseness. They are always, I mean, I remember very few moments when you speculate. So that when you are not sticking to the proof somehow, it's always in a way dry, because it's you always concentrate on what you can prove with very, very specific documents. Like, for example, in the film about the distribution of American films before 1974, you had a lot of graphics. Like, for example, at some point there was a graphic that contained the number of cinemas in all the countries where the American films were shown in 1920 something, including Romania. And I didn't know exactly the number. So Thailand, Taiwan, I don't know, it was from all over the world. So I became curious. Do you find this kind of, you pray to God and He sends you this kind of graphics and you just put it there, or you have to write to people from all these countries to find out how does it work?
Well, it varies. I was very lucky in that our university library is a repository for government documents, and from the period that I was working on, which was from the beginning of cinema up to I stopped in 1934 for that study, and they were all there. I could just go into our library and sit there going through statistics, great list of statistics, and it was rather boring work, but at least it was very easy to find them in that case. There was a lot of the material that went into that book was right in our own library. In terms of other work, yes, we had to go abroad. To work on French Impressionist cinema, one would have to go to Cinémathèque Française. And in 1979, I tried to get in, and I spent about 2 weeks in Paris being told, oh, come back on Thursday. Well, come back on Saturday. And finally, I went to the next archive I had contacted, which was the Brussels Cinémathèque. And Jacques Ledoux, the curator there, was having something feud with Henri Langlois at the UNATC Française, and so he was quite pleased to take him in and when I first talked to him in his office, I explained that I was doing this project and that I had this problem with Langlois, and I could not really afford to spend very much on fees to watch the films at the cinema, especially since it was going to be something like a month's here. But he said, oh, well, that's fine. But you understand, I cannot give you the key to the archive until I know I can trust you. Well, I never expected it to begin with. But about a week and a half later, I was working at the Prevost, and the Duke came in and handed me the keys, so I was able to work on the weekends. So there were all kinds of wonderful things like that happened along the way that were very helpful. And I think close to half of the films we watched that we had never seen from various foreign countries when we were doing the film history textbook, we watched at Brussels. It's a great archive. People don't think of it, but it is one of the world's largest film archives. So yeah, we worked in archives, we worked in libraries. We did what was necessary.
And maybe it's a naive question, but I have very big problems with my memory. Like if I watch 20 films, I start forgetting from the first ones that I watched. But at least I know that I have them on my computer, so I can come back to them. I imagine it was not the case when you were watching films in archives. You had to stick with you had the chance to watch the films once. So how did you do? Like you made a lot of. How did you, because your analyses are so precise. So I was always wondering, how did you do? Did you rewatch them? You took very detailed notes while you were looking at them.
Did you also study some of the films at an editing table? Did you watch them at an editing table? Because
Yes, I mean the Library of Congress had editing tables. Brussels had Prevost. So we were almost always looking at them on editing machines, able to stop, go back, start, and so forth.
That was before the video cassette, the VHS era, wasn't it?
Yes. Yes, this would have been the early 80s. So yes, we were looking at that. But we also made up a chart. I forget exactly what it was, but it was a table. The title of the film, the date of the film, and then various things that had in it, shot, reverse shot, and the various techniques we were looking at, cross-cutting. And so we had columns with boxes, and when we were watching the films, we would make notes on what happened, and using that particular technique. So we could, we could come up with statistics as to how many of these films were using each of these techniques and how often and that kind of thing. So yes, it was pretty precise. And we just, we copied a whole stack of those blank tables and took the service to archives. And then Janet Steiger and David and I went to the Library of Congress together and we sort of took turns. There were two of us at the machine at any given time, and then one was doing work on things like the trade papers, going through the trade papers, because it was rather tedious work in some ways. Some of these films were very ordinary, but there were always two of us, and we always used these sheets.
Also, you select in many of the books, in many books of yours, you select certain specific photographs on films that are always, as I said before, already said, very, very precise. They couldn't be exchanged with other photographs, so you need to take them probably from the films that you are watching. But I was also many times wondering, especially in relation to the most, to the more organized industries like Hollywood or Japanese. For example, a couple of years ago, we asked to a Japanese big company for the rights of a photo, and they asked us 500 euros. So I was wondering, how did you deal with those kind of problems with when you had, I don't know, when you had to illustrate something from a silent film by Lubitsch, but made by Warner or made by Paramount, so by big studios. Was this an issue at some point in your career, or you always, I know that you wrote about it and you explain, but I was curious, since the beginning it was always,
Well, fortunately, for the classical Hollywood cinema, we had a lot of illustrations in that book. For some reason, our editor at Routledge and Keaton Hall never asked us to get permission for anything. And I don't know whether that was naivete or boldness or what, but we never had to do it. Look, and of course, Exporting Entertainment didn't have any illustrations. And, for the Ivan the Terrible book, the assumption was that a Soviet film of that era was not in copyright in the United States. So that seemed to be all right with Princeton. But yes, many publishers in the United States were very worried about copyright infringement if you used frames from a film. And publishers, I've had many authors write to me about that problem, because publishers, for a start, you probably can't get permission, but if they do give you permission, they're going to charge you money.
Had there been, before your books, before your and David Baldwin's book, had there been film books using so many frames from film as opposed to production stills?
Yeah, not very many. I think it was made by filmmakers. I mean, Eisenstein's writings always have frames, and of course his drawings, but mostly frames. And, it really depended on the situation. But yeah, most books did not use frames, and ultimately it became a real problem for us and for other people in the United States. So I was asked to do a study of the concept of fair use, which is the assumption that if you are doing something with the image you're using, analyzing it or changing it in some way, it's called fair use. You don't have to get permission. And so I shared a panel.
Does it also have to do with the amount of image we're using?
Well, if you compare it with literature, yeah, fair use of literary text, they do give you a specific, the law gives a specific amount of percentage, yes. Of course, with film frames, you can use a lot of film frames and you're still using up a very small percentage of the total film. I mean,
Because the percentage of the total film would also include the sound.
well, sound didn't put into it.
Even without considering
Yeah,
this.
but I mean, you have something like a couple 100,000 frames in a feature film, and you're using 70, 75.
So it's negligible.
It's a tiny percentage. So I consulted with lawyers who were specialists in this area of fair use, and also with the Librarian of Congress. And I was assured that fair use was probably applicable to films, film frames, even though there was no law about it and no real precedent for it. But so I wrote up this report saying that this is the case, that you could use quite a large number of film frames and still, if you were analyzing them or using them for educational purposes, not just exploiting them for money, you could do it.
Does it also have to do with whether you're working with an academic publisher or with a mainstream commercial publisher?
Well, I think, well, there are various opinions on this, but we have published with non-academic presses and used film frames, and other people have as well. I think it really comes down to what you're doing with it, not so much what the publisher is doing. They do, most publishers will not put a picture on the cover or in advertising, because that's assumed to be something to do with the selling of the book, not with the analysis inside. We usually have trouble with the covers of our books, but we haven't had any problems since then with publishers insisting on permissions. And as I say, people have written to me, and I've written back, and I've referred them to my report, which is online. And I think publishers have really changed their minds. Certainly McGraw-Hill, which publishes our textbooks, was very reluctant at first, but they have accepted this idea that fair use applies to educational purposes, which is certainly what a textbook is. And so we have hundreds and hundreds of illustrations in books, but we do not have the power to get an image on the cover unless we can get permission, and sometimes we can. So for example, with film art, the 13th edition has a film frame from La La Land on the cover. And we spent 4 months trying to get that permission to put that on, because we weren't about to use it without permission. But fortunately, we knew Damien Chazelle, and finally we just, the company that owned it, Lionsgate, was going to charge a huge amount of money for it. And he got in touch with them and said, no, I want my film on the cover of this book, which he had used himself as a student, and we were charged. So that happened finally, but it was we were convinced that it was never going to actually turn out well.
Maybe even more shocking is that Roger told us a little earlier that we also needed approval from the actors.
Yes. Emma Stone and Ryan Gosling had to sign permission forms. But they did because Damien told them.
But it seems quite hard to take.
Yes.
So, if going further, discussing a little bit about the two very important and very well-known textbooks that you wrote together with Mr. Caldwell, Film Art and Introduction and Film History and Introduction. Film History of Introduction, of course, is the first book of yours that was translated recently into Romanian. Those two books I think you wrote in the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, no? Like Film Art was the first?
Yeah, Film Art was the first, and we started writing that in 1977, and it came out in 1979. Yeah, and then we started work on the history textbook in 1987, and it came out in 1993. So there was about a 10-year gap in terms of when we decided to write the two books.
I wouldn't go very much into details about them because you already addressed this in your speech 2 days ago, and we also made together a Zoom conversation specifically of film history. It's like 1 hour long, and you can find it on YouTube if you search Kristin Thompson and Doran Censor, you will find it. There is Ilya Andreev's, it's 1 hour long. We discussed a lot about this, but to continue the conversation we started before, is, for example, in a book like Film History, there you address so many, not only types of films or genres, but also regions and specificities from all these regions, like you and Mr. Bobber described some point Australian films from the 1910s, Indian films from the 20s, etc. So again, for a book that was written before the digital era, like the first edition at least, the first editions, I was also wondering, how did you, for example, you went to archives probably to watch the majority of the films, no?
Well, some of the films we saw at the Pordenone Film Festival. For example, they had a retrospective of all the surviving Indian films, silent films, which was a very wonderful program because they had an Indian chamber group that came and played appropriate music, and they were even singing along at times. But we saw, we knew by the end of that festival all the silent films that survived, and I found prints of some of them in the British Film Institute, so I was able to take frames from that. So we had a 1912 Indian film in the book on the start, and it's that kind of thing. Those festivals have been enormously helpful in looking at films from various parts of the world. They've covered a great deal of geography by this time. We first went in 1985 and saw Swedish films, silent films, and you keep going and you keep seeing a different country every year. And same with the Chinmori Lovato. They had a wonderful Pan-African retrospective a few years ago. So those have been extremely helpful. Then you have to find a way to get the frames, but often you can do that.
But for the most recent parts of the book, that don't deal with the silent period, for example, which is even harder because the quantity is not harder, but the quantity of films can be very bigger in time, which is also something stated in so the quantity of films grew more and more, which is also something stated in the book. But I was curious, what kind, for example, I know that you already told us days ago that you spread the book into art practically. You write mostly of the first three parts, and Mr. Warner, the second part is different in inclusions, or yours in that part of his in the first part. But still, how did you, I don't know, when you deal in two paragraphs about, I don't know, something related to Chinese, not Chinese, or Taiwanese films, or Thailand films from the 50s, very brief or something. I was always wondering how much you do for that. Did you write to Taiwanese friends, historians, and ask them what's the most relevant thing to do, or did you read some books, if there existed already about them? Did you went to the Taiwanese archive and ask them, which was the most relevant piece from this field, or because it's so wide? I mean, I had to do the index of the books. So it was one of the most boring experiences I've ever had, and it was very long. You have like thousands of titles of films that I mentioned, and half of them I didn't see, and maybe a quarter I've never heard of. But I consider myself quite disciplined. Remembering, at least remembering titles of films. So how did you manage to do such film? How many hours you slept?
Well, fortunately, as I mentioned, Brussels has an extraordinarily large collection. The law there is that every film that comes in and gets distributed in the country is deposited at the archive after it's ended. So they have a lot of contemporary films from all over the world, and they have some festivals there. David was able to look at quite a lot of films, contemporary films there. I'm not sure we could have done this book without the collaboration of that archive. But then some of what you're talking about, I think, came into later editions. They probably weren't in the first edition because David then became very interested in Hong Kong cinema. He wrote a book on Hong Kong cinema. He started going to Hong Kong to the festival every year, starting in 1995. So just a short time after the first edition of the book had come out. And he went to Taiwan, and he went to Shanghai. We had been in China doing lectures in 1988. We were shown films by the fifth generation of filmmakers. So we went, in some cases, to the source. And then somewhat later, when David retired, we were able to go to film festivals much more frequently. So we were going to Vancouver every year, and they have a very good selection of contemporary films. We kept going to Pordenone. We ended up going to Bologna every year until 2019. So we would find out about films there, programs and so forth. That was certainly one way that we kept up.
One of the things that I admire working closely on the translation of film production was the selection of films itself, because besides the canon films, besides the more, the medium films, the novel films, there were a lot of inclusions of films that were not in the canon, that you and Mr. Vogel seem to have really enjoyed. And although they are not very known, or maybe they are very small films, like films maybe like Humani or independent Indonesia, maybe. I watched it and it was amazing, but I never heard of it. So I really, really appreciated this approach of silently introducing, offering a chance to other films that are not well known to enter somehow the canon. Because when you put them, in a phrase with very important films that won the Palme d'Or or Oscars, etc., then you really put them on the same level with them, offering, making readers very curious to learn about them. And we do this very constantly, no matter the period that you are dealing with. And also, another aspect that I thought was really intriguing was the introduction, but it's something that we could generalize, is the attention that you pay, like both of you pay to different media. The book also tackles video games. Like your book on, for example, you have a very important part of the book that you dedicated to the Frodo franchise, the lyrics to the impact, for example, of the franchise to video games. But you also found it here. There are a lot of some links to videos, music videos, and they are very intriguing, like the parallel between Darren and the conceptual video album of Beyonce, or Lemonade, or Radiohead. There are chapters on very, very consistent chapters on different experimental traditions, including museum installations. So it's really a huge, very, very wide topics that very extended, let's say, interest that you had. What I didn't find at all and I'm just curious about, I think I never found in your writings an interest in useful things, or this type of, let's say, educational films. I think it's something, industrial, yes, and this becomes more and more, I don't know, at least in the scholar, academic research, very important discipline itself somehow. It's something that you are never interested in, or just that you never get close to be interested in them.
Well, I can't say I was interested in them, but I think we were thinking of the professors who would be using the books. And I suspect very few of them would use a chapter or a section of a chapter on industrial films, unless they were very famous filmmakers. Oliveira's film on Gray. But we had to stop somewhere. And, there are still people who say that we should not have had the chapters on experimental cinema and documentary. I think animation they allowed it. Well, yes, some people insist on having them in. We used to have surveys of our users taken by McGraw-Hill, and there were always people who say, I never use the chapters on documentary or industrial film, experimental films, documentaries, animated films. I don't use those. And the others would say, yeah, I do. I use them all. you're going to keep in the ones that people use and pay no attention to the people who don't use them because they can just skip over them by complaining.
We will get to the last part of our intervention and then open the discussion to the audience. We also wanted to tackle a little bit, some of your preoccupations that we couldn't put in certain categories. Like, for example, one of the audiobooks that we both admire very much is a book that we wrote on called Frodo Franchise. The Frodo Franchise is a whole and very consistent book. I think it's more than 300 pages long.
About that.
About the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It was a book, you started writing this book while the film was still in production, no? I think it was already starting to be shot.
The first film had come out. I certainly was not considering writing anything on it before the first film because I had no idea whether I could like it enough to live with it for long enough to write a book on it. And I did like it very much. I mean, it's an American film, but I certainly thought it was something I could work with. And what made me interested is the fact that I was hearing so much about how innovative the film was in all ways, in ways that the filmmakers interacted with the video game makers, the way they were using the internet to publicize the film at a time when that was fairly rare still. The fact that they were doing these enormous supplements for the extended editions, various things that had to do with digital technology. I was interested in the use of fan sites for publicity, which were growing at the time. So it wasn't just a book on the films, it was about the franchise as a whole. And I wanted to do the book, but I had no idea how to go about it because it's made by a big company. All of the people who work on it would have confidentiality agreements in their contracts. They wouldn't be able to talk to me without permission. And so I was trying to think of some way I could get in touch with either Peter Jackson or Barry Osborne, the producer, the line producer who was there on the site. And I happened in the fall of 2002 to be at a conference in Australia giving a paper, and a woman came up to me and started talking, and she said, well, if you're writing this book, I could put you in touch with Barry Osborne. Okay. So she did that, and I actually started working on the book right after that because I went to New Zealand after to see some Egyptian pieces in a museum, but The Two Towers was about to come out, and there were tours being given of the locations already after it was released for one film. There were several tour companies in Queenstown that were taking people to the locations. So I did my very first interviews right there, even not being sure I could do the book, but I interviewed those people to find out how the film had influenced their lives, their businesses. And I said, I'll come back in 2 years and find out how you've done as a result of these films. And I did go back and interviewed them, and they had bought bigger planes, more four-wheel vehicles and so forth. They had stopped working out of their homes and had offices downtown. They were done very well. But anyway, that was the start of it. And I went through a long process with Inline Cinema for months and months. I can't get into it, it's just too long a story. But finally I did go down and 3 separate times I did interviews with a lot of people. All the designers, Peter Jackson, Barry Osborne, government officials who were involved in using the film to promote themselves, basically. So that's, I started it before the second film had been released.
One of the things that I particularly like about that book is how it straddles the distinction between scholarship and journalism. I mean, it's certainly a scholarly work, it's thorough, it's meticulous, it doesn't stop until it gets at the bottom of things, but at the same time it's an easy read, it's accessible, the prose is always clear, it gets you easily from one paragraph to the next. Do these issues matter to you? Accessibility, the distinction between journalism and scholarship, does it mean anything to you?
Well, I know some people would make a distinction. I don't see any reason why a book should be unintelligible, as many film books are. You can write the stuff in clear prose. I think it helped that David and I had started a blog in 2006, which was about when I was writing the book itself after I had done the interviews. And
was the blog, when you started the blog, when you launched the blog, was that like a conscious, deliberate decision to reach a more popular readership and maybe invigorate your writing? Was it a natural extension of what you had been doing until that point, or was it something of a stretch?
Well, the reason we started it was rather simple. I mentioned that McGraw-Hill used to do surveys of users, and most of them, their suggestions were pretty useless. But somebody said, they should start a blog. And I thought, oh, yeah, maybe we should. And it was originally an idea which we figured was a publicity thing for the textbook, for film art and introduction. And we called it Observations on Film Art because there was that connection. But when we started writing the pieces, we realized there was no way we could just write something that was intended to illustrate, cross-cutting or something like that. We just got inspired by something we saw. We went to a festival, we'd see a film, we'd report on it, and I wrote something on the art and animation studio. Just things we wanted to write about, which was kind of a relief because we never had, after that point, to submit articles to journals and have them read by outside readers and so forth. It was our own little journal, and we could write it in a rather casual way. I think we learned to write more casually when we started blogging.
One of the most popular things on the blog was one thing that you did and you kept doing, and you're still doing it at the end of each year. Instead of giving the readers a top 10 of the best films of whatever, 2022, 2023, you go not on 100, but 90, I think, 90 years back, and you say the best films of 1932, the best films of 1933. How did you start that, and how did it get so popular?
Well, we started it because when we wrote the classical Hollywood cinema, we decided that the classical Hollywood cinema had sort of come together as a thing by 1917. And so we wrote a happy birthday classical cinema in 2007, so it was 90 years before. And I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting idea. It wasn't intended as, it wasn't even given as a 10 best list. It was just discussing a few films from that period. But I just went on with it and decided, well, it's a 10 best list. It's our 10 best list. It's not current films, but it's 90 years ago. And so every year I try to talk about the classics, the obvious films that one we talk about, like M for 1931. But I always try to find a fairly obscure, but what I think is a very good film, and I do that. So it's partly educational, I suppose, for people who don't know anything about cinema, very little. But even people who know something about cinema usually learn something from one or two new films.
For me, it seems that in the same direction or with the same purpose, it's also the fact that you started to collaborate with Criterion Collection, doing many video essays related to specific films that are made available on the platform. You also participated or wrote texts for DVD or Blu-ray releases of classical films together with also David Mobley. And so I think together with the textbooks that you wrote, these are also with the blog. I always found these gestures something very generous and democratic in a way towards a wider audience, to give access to a wider audience than I don't know, the film students or professionals from cinema to knowledge and to accessible, to give access, because you always deal, even on the blog, you deal very, I don't know, aesthetical, specific and quite complicated sometimes issues, but you and Mr. Border, you always try to explain them and to illustrate them, to include photographs like in the books, to make them accessible, not to make them more obscure than they already are, but to do the opposite gesture, which is something quite rare, I think, in the academia. I think in the academia, contemporary academia, we tend to discuss between experts. I mean, if I'm an expert or something, I will discuss with the other experts, and I wouldn't care necessarily about the others, because it's like, so it's something that, I don't know, I found to be quite atypical in this
Yes, well, I would agree. I have to admit we get paid by Criterion. Yes, but not a huge amount, and that's not why we do it. But yeah, we owe a lot to Criterion. I mentioned the use of frames and permissions and that kind of thing. They've always given us permission to use clips, which aren't available to the public, but they are used in the textbooks. There is online supplemental material for the textbooks, and they let us use clips. They consider that our work is training the customers of the future for them. And they like to have this sort of non-scholarly aspect to Criterion. So, yeah, it is something that I think is a little more accessible than used for scholarship, and it's being put into, well, there are lots of fans of Criterion. They are a brand, so some people collect every DVD they put out and that sort of thing. Yeah, it is an interesting way. I never thought I would be doing video essays as analysis, but we put out 50 so far among the three of us. Jeff Smith, our third collaborator, also does these. And it's kind of fun, actually. It's made me go back to some films that I didn't like very much, and when I first saw them, and I liked very much more later, like Lubitsch's Clooney Brown, for example. That was much more enjoyable, just the fact of analyzing it. Well, those who came to see The Long Day Closes saw one example of what we've done for Criterion. And David Bordwell's analysis of Vagabond is on YouTube. So, unfortunately, those aren't, the rest of them are not available outside North America. But unfortunately, it's a matter of rights. Criterion simply can't pay the rights for every territory.
When reading David Bordwell, I got the feeling that he came from the world of cinephilia, And when he entered academia, he temporarily put that behind him, his ties to non-academic cinephilia for a while weren't that close. And then after he stopped teaching, it's like I feel the relief with which he sort of returned to his cinephile roots somehow. Hence that wonderful book he did, the Rhapsodes on 1940s American film critics, which were before academia, before film studies had become an academic subject. And he writes with such passion, and I was wondering, what's your own connection, what's your own history with non-academic cinephilia, with non-academic film cultures?
Well, I don't think I had much of any. I mean, I went to movies, and I saw the occasional foreign film when I was in high school. But I mean, for me, a foreign film was Zorba the Greek. It wasn't Antonioni. But David had actually studied on his own when he was a teenager. He read Eisenstein, he read Andrew Saras, I don't know what else, but he was reading stuff that we would be reading in classes. And he was all on his own. I mean, he lived on a farm. And I'm not entirely sure how he first got exposed to these. Exposed to maybe the local library. But anyway, he had a sort of semi-academic streak in him, obviously, from early on. But I think you're right. He went back to his youthful passions when he wrote his last book. So in Rhapsody, certainly, but also reinventing Hollywood. He loved 40s films all his life, and he took the chance to.
Yeah, there's like a new engagement with Hollywood. It's part of it.
Yeah. He had written books on Ozu and Dreyer and Eisenstein.
He had never denied that he loved those films, but it suddenly burst out.
Yes, and then finally, Perplexing Plots. He had always been a murder mystery fan, so he certainly did an enormous amount of research in areas that he hadn't known about before. Obscure Broadway plays from the 1910s, murder mysteries that had all kinds of trick twists to them and that kind of thing. He really loved doing that kind of thing, and I think that shows through. I mean, some people say that it's his best book, which is possible. Others would say Roosevelt. But anyway, I think he did return to the things that he had loved as before he went to college.
I have two more things.
Yeah.
Yes. One thing that I want to just briefly add, because it was we were discussing about cinephilia and film culture, etc., is that among the most passionate chapters in books that I've ever read was a chapter from the Frodo franchise book on the fan subcultures. I found it so enriching, and so I did. I don't know, because she writes about all these platforms and websites that started to appear concomitantly, at the same time that the film was being produced, of very many fans of the books, of course, of Tolkien's books, that were commenting and, discussing between them and sometimes even criticizing different aspects related to production. And she made an amazing research, interviewing a lot of these generators of internet materials, but also the perspective of the producers and of artists involved in the making of the film. And like in, less than 100 pages, it's like this beautiful and very complex link between the new media, the connections from many perspectives. Like she would analyze silent cinema. She used the same instruments. She was analyzing the economical impact, let's say, the cultural impact of this new relation, let's say, that started to consolidate together with the internet and digitization, etc. From an aesthetical perspective, I mean, the aesthetic impact, and I don't know, and you made it, you gave it so much importance. I really found it moving. I was never interested in that before. I always thought it's something that me as an aspiring serious historian, why would I care about those websites and those platforms? It was so, I don't know, so
For you or for them?
for me.
Yours, no.
No, of course I was no. I was so thankful. This is what I was trying to say. I was so thankful that I read that.
Yes, well, at this point, we tend to think of internet publicists and internet websites as just a natural thing that you have with films, but at the time I started working on this book, very few actors, for example, had websites. The only person who was one of the cast of The Lord of the Rings who had a website at that point was Ian McKellen. None of the others had websites. And when he introduced his webmaster to the other actors, they said, "Oh, could you do one for me?" And of course, the idea of having big publicity campaigns online was very new as well. New Line had done one for Austin Powers, but really The Lord of the Rings was where they got into doing really major websites. And I remember this was the time of dial-up. If you wanted to see a trailer for The Two Towers, you had to leave it downloading overnight for a 3-minute trailer. So the people were doing that. Millions of people were doing it. So that was, you know, that was an inspiration to realize that the fans were starting to do the publicity for the filmmakers, not all the publicity. But I had 2 chapters on the internet and Lord of the Rings. The first one was on the official websites, or the websites that were at least tolerated, like Ian McKellen had a website. He started a diary of the filmmaking. And the New Line was not terribly happy with that, but hey, it was Ian McKellen, so what could they do? And on the other hand, there were all these fan sites that started, so I had to have a second chapter just to deal with them. But they were very, very important publicizing that film, of course.
Yeah, and of course, I just realized when I was reading it that, of course, these are some phenomena that have a big impact on the industry from so many levels that you describe in the book. So I don't know, really, I don't know, great thing. I think we cannot finish our part of the perform activity before addressing something about other big passions and that are not necessarily always related to film directly, like your complementary activity as an Egyptologist. The fact that your newest book, I think, the newest released book, is dealing with this part of your professional activity, and also that of literary critic. You already published a book that I haven't read, unfortunately, on E.G. Wodehouse.
I haven't read it either. It was very hard to find, wasn't it?
Well, it was published by a very small press, a one-man press, a guy who was an obsessive fan of Wodehouse. So he was publishing translations of Wodehouse. And so he published my book, and then unfortunately he died a few months later. And the book was remaindered at that point. So yeah, it's hard to find.
But you are the custodian, no, of Wodehouse.
You were.
Well,
Or you were.
I was the curator, the archivist of the P.G. Wodehouse archive from 1985 to 2012, and then it went to the British Library. So, yeah, I had complete access. That was great.
And about Egyptology?
Well, I have this habit, which you may have realized, that I turn my obsessions into research projects. And Woodhouse was one of those. I became obsessed with Woodhouse. Wrote a book on it, of course. What else? And then I took a trip to Egypt in 1992 and started to get very obsessed with this one period of ancient Egypt. And I started getting conference papers, and I got invited in 2000 to join an expedition in Egypt, which I've looked at ever since. And I just published a huge 2-volume set, a catalog of statuary fragments from our site. So, yes. I put it there.
I always imagine those people, I mean both Egyptologists as a bunch and Woodhouseians, P.G. Woodhouse fans, to be very territorial and reluctant to allow newcomers on their territory. It wasn't like that.
Well, I remember going on my first research trip for Woodhouse to an archive at Dulwich College in London, where Woodhouse went to school. And I was looking at some letters that had been written by someone else to Woodhouse. They had a large collection. And the curator was hovering over me as I sat there with my little index cards and took notes. And later she said, "Oh, I was just keeping an eye on you, and I knew you were a researcher. You were a scholar." And she called up the heir to the Woodhouse estate, who had his own collection, and said, "She's okay. You can invite her down." So I roomed my way in. But, yeah, it's, Egyptology is a little harder to break into.
But now you are inside.
Oh, yes. Lectured at the British Museum and so on.
And last thing, and then we open to audience. You are working now on new projects, or currently?
Well, I had been working on a book analyzing Tolkien's novels way back in the 90s, and I had to put it aside to work on the statuary book. So it had been 10 years since I'd actually been working on the Tolkien book, but I've gone back to it, and it's over halfway finished. So yeah, that's my current project.
So now it's your turn. If anyone has a question or...
Should we pass the mic?
Yeah, of course. Should it be your
No, there was another mic. Okay, there's someone there. Yes, let me see.
Hello, and thank you very much. I have a question related to the Exporting Entertainment book. When you mentioned that already before the 20s, Hollywood had become a presence and a dominating presence all over the world, which are the reasons for it? Was it the sheer number of films that was produced? Was it the way they were exported? Or had it to do also with the formal norms, the aesthetic of the films that made them widely, interesting for audiences everywhere?
Well, it's a combination of things. Partly, it was World War I. But American companies were already setting up their own distribution centers abroad before the war. So Universal, for example, had an office in Japan quite early. And they were slowly, originally London companies were distributing American films. They'd ship their negatives over to London, and then from there they would be dispersed. But then they stopped doing that, and they started doing their own distribution. So it was obviously a sort of concerted thing that the various companies were using similar tactics to expand. And I think there were things like genre. People loved Westerns. I mean, people were making Westerns in France and Germany and so forth. So I think there was something about partly the American landscapes and And some of the earliest stars, of course, were in American films. Lawrence and Mary Pickford and so on. And Charlie Chaplin had something to do with it. He's enormously successful and popular. So those are some of the factors.
Other questions?
I'm wondering if you think there are themes or techniques that were used or more common in old Hollywood that are lost or very little used today in modern Hollywood. And no, isn't it?
Yes, David was in the process of researching a book on the teens, basically 1910 to 1924. And he was going to write about what he called the tableau style, which was basically a European style that was quite different from Hollywood. It was much less dependent on cutting. It was more dependent on very careful and complex staging, in depth, in front of the camera, and the camera just sitting there, without cut-ins, without shot reverse shot. And it was very, very common all over Europe. It kept up because I think to a certain degree people were not seeing Hollywood films during the war, especially in Germany. It was a big ban on imports. So this tableau style was essentially gone. They used it to some extent in early Hollywood films, but it disappeared. Once they discovered they could edit, they could cut into close-ups to make sure you saw someone's expression. They could cut into shot reverse shot to have people's expressions visible during a conversation. And they could use the 180-degree rule to keep clarity and chases and fights and things like that. So yeah, I think that was a very important system that was used abroad, the tableau style. And David has written quite a bit about that on our blog. There are some analyses of early films that use that style. And he also talks about it in a book called The History of Film Style, and another book called Figures Traced in Light, which is about staging, entirely about staging. And he talks about other filmmakers who do use the tableau style, like Nicolopoulos.
Yeah, because it came back.
Yes, it came back.
In the art cinema.
Right, in the art cinema it is used, but not so much. I think you very seldom see it used in Hollywood. So if you wanted to go on the blog, you could see some. There's a pretty good search engine. So and there's also topics down the right side of the. You can see links to silent film. If you wanted to look up some of that. But that's the main thing that comes to mind is this huge difference in style during that period.
Someone in the back.
Nu știu, da, a venit.
First of all, it's a big honor to have you here. So I would like to ask you something which I know it has a lot of coverage, like literature, but having you here, I have to ask you this. If you could briefly describe this problem-solving model, and what do you feel are some of its limitations in like analyzing film style? Thank you.
Well, that's a tough one. Well, I think almost all the technological innovations that came in Hollywood that we talk about were solutions to problems. Just the cut in itself, close-ups of actors, because they were becoming more popular. People were wanting to see them instead of seeing them in the distance. And shot reverse shot to show people's expressions. But also things like innovation of incandescent lighting when sound came in. It was a really quite a change in the way that lighting looked at that point. Arc lighting is much harsher and gives more contrast. But you need to use incandescent lighting because the arc lamps make noise, and that would be picked up by the camera, but incandescent lighting didn't. And so you get into the 30s and you have that problem solved, and the change becomes to get this much softer look to the photography. So there's something.
And how about the limitations? Okay, so this is an explanation how language develops or style changes. And how about the limitations?
Well, certainly people at the time were very disappointed. People who loved silent cinema pointed out that many things that had been developed in silent cinema were lost in silent cinema. Certainly staging, and some of the camera movements that had been developed during the 1920s. I mean, you get The Last Laugh coming out in 1924 with the camera being on a swing and so forth. And that got picked up in Hollywood right away. They put tracks on the ceiling and suspended cameras, moved them over banqueting tables and that kind of thing. And that just went away completely during the sound period. And never really came back, I don't think. So you're asking about the limitations of the problem-solving method? I don't know. I think it would depend on very specific examples.
I come from a background of I've studied film directing, and I was greatly influenced by this thinking of style in terms of resolving different problems in expression. And I think that this kind of model works best with people who are very rational and justify their instruments very rationally. But what if we are studying, for example, like experimental films?
I think in some ways you may have to ask the filmmaker, which to some extent we've done. We've interviewed filmmakers and we know some filmmakers. And I think the idea of problem solving in filmmaking came to us from someone who was a filmmaker who said, you're just solving problems all day. So that could be, and of course Truffaut says it in The Lead American, just answering questions all day, making decisions. So yeah, I think most film scholars these days don't pay much attention to filmmakers. They say there's the death of the auteur. We don't pay attention to filmmakers. Just look at the films in society and interpret them. But yeah, we did some interviews with filmmakers who had worked in the silent period for the classical Hollywood cinema. So not very many, because there weren't that many left alive. But we talked to Carl Struess, who was one of the great cinematographers of the films. He was 94, but we managed to interview him, some others. So I guess that would be one answer. Pay attention to filmmakers.
Thank you very much.
Other questions?
So what I noticed is that, I don't know, in the 90s or even early 2000s, it was really popular to consider yourself a cinephile and look through the work of like really old directors from like classical periods. But I observed that nowadays, I don't know, with TikTok, YouTube, I mean, our generation thinks that everyone can do a film, and you don't really have to history of cinema, and I'm quite curious, what do you think about the direction of cinema? Because I've also heard some voices that think that cinema is like real cinema is quite dead or cannot be seen with these old commercial movies like from Netflix and TikTok. Also the job of being a film critic, because like again with social media anyone can make like a TikTok account and blog and do some reviews on movies, and how the younger generation gives credit to film critics and like everything that you've done so far.
Yes, we have this problem at Madison, that young filmmakers taking classes of filmmaking say, I don't need to study film history, I don't need to look at the films that are being shown in our Cinematheque, which shows 3 films every week. The idea, I guess, being, I don't want to be influenced, I want to be inspired and do my own thing. How do you know somebody's not done it before? They probably have. I mean, how many people really come up with original ideas? That's one answer. Another answer is that some of the great filmmakers of our time are cinephilics and know a great deal about the history of cinema. You look at someone like Damien Chazelle, he has an encyclopedic knowledge of film history. Quentin Tarantino, who's such a not so admired by young people, he again has a huge, not quite as wide, I mean, he has specific things that he loves, whereas Damien seems to like everything. So I think there's evidence that good filmmakers know film history. There's plenty of evidence for that. As to critics, I've seen people who write short reviews on, I'm old-fashioned, not just on Facebook, but they do that better. And they're very bland, they're okay. They have, these people get a small following of people, so maybe they'll get 18 or 20 comments, and what kind of impact are they really having? And they certainly don't know from history. And that is also, unfortunately, true of some professional critics. Especially these days. I think they look at a very challenging film and they just say it's bad because they don't understand it. They don't realize the conventions it's using or the conventions it's departing from. And I kind of wonder if something like Last Marion Bed or 8½, or Pickpocket were to be made today, would the critics just dismiss it? I mean, would they take the trouble to figure out what this film is trying to do? Which I think is the job of a critic, if it's a difficult film. You have to think about it. Maybe watching it. So I do think film history is still important, and it's a bad idea because let's go with our own ideas.
Yeah, but the problem is that the younger generation seems like to not really care about it. And how do you think it's gonna affect the film industry, the next movies? Because we've been talking about classical movies, but what about the future of cinema?
Well, I think there are enough people who do study film history that possibly those are going to be the ones who succeed. And also, I think our biggest problem in the future is AI. So that's what I would worry about. But I do think there are a lot of film lovers out there, and some of them are filmmakers, aspiring filmmakers. But that would be the advice I would give them if I could.
Firstly, it's really amazing having you here, and I'm really nervous and hope this question makes sense. I want to ask you something about Lubitsch's relationships, because he usually tackles love triangles. he sometimes has really queer relationships, and until Design for Living, he acts like he doesn't want to let this kind of queer relationship get on end. Like in I Don't Want to Be a Man, there's Ozzy Oswalda who is trying to transition to being a man, and she actually makes out multiple times with her protector who doesn't know that she is transitioned. And then in Love Parade, there's this non-normative dynamic where not Maurice Chevalier, but the queen has the power in the relationship, but by the end, you have to have Maurice Chevalier have the power in the couple. But then, you know, in Design for Living, in the end, you have the love triangle and the polyamorous relationship established again and then going off on their merry way. And I was wondering why was it only in 1943 that Lubitsch decided it was okay to have that kind of an ending?
Well, he had developed a reputation for pushing the envelope, shall we say. And of course that was right before the code came in, so he could. I mean, that's one answer, just he could do it. Later on, he wouldn't be able to. I suspect the people were suspecting that that was going to happen. But also, I think people were rather naive about these things at the time. They didn't necessarily recognize a trans character or a gay relationship. I mean, Cary Grant can say, I'm gay all of a sudden, and bringing a baby, and, you know, probably just went over his head, and they didn't notice it. Of course, it wasn't a very widespread term at the time, but yes. I guess that's all I can say.
Yeah, but still, the ending in Love Parade seems really forced. Like, he kind of wanted it to go that way, but then after the opera scene, it's full heteronormative, and it's a bit awkward. And
yeah, well, I guess I would agree. I find that whole film a little awkward.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you regarding the modern movies from today. Based on your experience, based on your knowledge, what is your opinion regarding the modern movies? Because from what I saw, there are many movies that appear that are connected with older movies, but they are trying to be made differently for the modern audience, or to tell a sequel or a prequel, depending on the idea. What is your opinion regarding the evolution of cinema into the modern movies, and how it is a good evolution or bad evolution? And another question might be, how can you, no, not how can you, what is your opinion based on the idea that you use old ideas in new ways, and if they are used better or if they are used worse than the original idea?
Well, for one thing, Hollywood was doing that all along. I mean, if you read about the system of Warner Brothers, the idea that they would, I mean, maybe this is a myth, but the idea was when somebody finished a script, it was put on a shelf, and then gradually they worked their way through and they were remaking each one. Not necessarily in an obvious way, but, you know, the most famous one is Please Go Friday, where they changed the gender of the reporters. But you look at ordinary Warner Brothers films, and they're just the same kinds of stories keep coming, and that's a deliberate policy on their part. So there were remakes before. I think the idea of, say, remaking Psycho, shot for shot, and that kind of thing is just absurd. But some of them succeed. I mean, You Got Mail is a remake of Shop Around the Corner, and most people don't know that, so they'll go and see it because it's got, stars they like and that kind of thing. That doesn't seem to be hurting Hollywood so much as the franchise movement, where you've got so many films being made in the same universe. And people talk about the fact that the Marvel universe is sort of running out of steam because people are just so tired of seeing these different combinations of superheroes and so on. And it does seem to be driving away the more mature audience. They don't want to see those films. And people complain about why aren't there more films made for adults. And it seems like some of the films that are being made for adults are being imported from other countries. You look at something like The Zone of Interest, for example. Now, there's a terrific film, and it was successful in a sense. Got a couple of Oscars, streaming. A24 has put out a Blu-ray, it cost $35. Yeah, there are ways to find good films for adults, but it's not necessarily in the multiplex. And I think that is a big. It's amazing how many films are being put out that are original, and yet they completely fail because people don't know about them. They really don't know the directors. They don't know the actors necessarily. Yeah, there is an imbalance in Hollywood. There's no question. I think it's mostly the franchises, the superhero franchises, Godzilla franchises, and that sort of thing.
Other questions?
Hello. What would you say constitutes a good movie review? How do you go about doing one?
Well, I'm not a professional reviewer, but sometimes I do pieces on the blog that are sort of reviews. I think it's most important to go into the film without preconceptions, because I think that's what a lot of critics do these days. They go in, they see something that they expect to be a certain way, and it's not, and they just dismiss it. They don't try to understand it. The example I think of recently was Alex Garland's film Home, which got terrible reviews, and was a huge flop. Made almost no money, certainly didn't make a profit. I don't know if you're familiar with the film that got released over here.
Which film?
It's Men by Alex Garland, which is a horror film. And it's a very unusual horror film, but it's definitely a horror film. And the interesting thing to me was that if you look on the internet, and you look at the sites of the horror fans, they understood the film perfectly. They liked it, they gave it the reviews, they went in expecting a horror film, and they got one. And the reviewers went in expecting some kind of art film, because Alex Garland has a reputation and they could. But and it didn't occur to them that this is not what was going on in the film. So I just think, why did they not think about this for a while and try to figure out what this film really was trying to do, which was experiment. That's all too common these days among reviewers. You get really thoughtless, I guess I would say thoughtless reviews that are based on preconceptions.
You think maybe they're not sitting enough with material or like pondering enough on it?
Sorry,
You think they're not like sitting with the material enough, like going through it again or trying to dissect it enough?
well, one problem is they probably don't have a chance to look at the film a second time before they write about it. They're expected to write immediately about it. But what I do is try in some ways to see it again. So in a way, I'm doing something a little cheating, that I can do something that the reviewers can't. Well, in this case, A24 actually ran it online just once for its fans. So I got to watch the film again just in that one showing. And I figured it out more, and I got frames and that kind of thing. That certainly made it easier. I do think that it's pretty that reviewers don't have a chance to see a film again before they write about it. But I think reviewers of the past did not have this problem. They only saw a film once, say, Fellini's 8.5. They had to confront something that's pretty weird for that period, and probably went against their expectations, but they clunked. I mean, somehow these reviewers in the late 40s, 50s, 60s were willing to take these films at face value rather than expecting something that wasn't going to be there. So it's hard to explain that. I mean, I don't know why critics of today don't behave the way critics of that period did. It's not as if they're not educated or I don't understand why current reviewers, I'm talking about people who get paid a lot of money to review for Variety or Hollywood Reporter. I don't understand why they are so unwilling to try to figure out movies. I find it actually quite fun. I mean, I look at something like Laszlo Nemesh's Sunset, which is a very challenging film, but I thought it was terrific, and I knew somebody at Sony, and I got a screener to watch it a second time before I wrote about it. I find this really exciting to see a film that's that challenging and try to figure it out. Why do these reviewers not feel that way?
That's a very interesting way to go about it. And because you mentioned it again, I was going to ask, how did you feel about 8.5? Because I watched it, I think, last year, and not knowing anything about it, my first view of it was a bit hard. I think it's a hard movie to sit through and sit with. How did you feel about it?
Well, it's not one of my favorite films, but I can sit through it and like it. I think it's partly having seen other films of the same sort. It's the background, again. What was the norm in the 50s and the early 60s? Well, other films like this, other television films. Brightstone was working, Antonioni, Bardini, Ray in India. There were films coming out all the time that people had to just cope with. And so you go into 8.5 and you've already seen some Fellini, you've already seen some Bresson, whoever, you'd be better prepared for it. I think we do have to learn how to watch movies. It's not a sort of automatic thing.
Thank you.
If there are other questions, we are in the last part of our meeting.
Hello. Cinema will represent such a big part of your life, and I was really curious about the things that cinema taught you, and what are the things that you are grateful for when we are talking about cinema.
Yeah, that's a different. I think it's taught me a great deal about the world. I mean, looking at Romanian films before I came here, I learned more about Romania and here I am. I've seen films from all over the world now, which I never would have seen had I not started in the profession. And that's basically, I mean, it's making entertaining, it's sounding interesting, but beyond that, that's affecting my life. It's really easier for me to go with other cultures.
So I have a super trivial and specific question, so thank you all for indulging me for a moment. I believe you must be aware that there is a reference to you in the beginning of Baghead, which is a film from 2008 by the Douglas brothers. There's an apparition of a character called Kristin Thompson, and I was wondering if you ever were offered to appear as yourself in the film, because it's an actress that plays you actually.
No, actually, I had never heard that this existed, so I certainly was not asked to be in it. But, what was the title again?
Baghead from 2008.
I will look it up.
It's a Mumbledore. Because the character is actually, she holds a Q&A at an underground film festival, so I actually thought it was you the first time.
Is she a film historian or is she a film scholar? The character?
It's very small, like a few seconds. It's not an actual character, but she is, I believe, Sorry?
She's killed?
No. She presents because she's, I think, the director of an underground film festival in LA or something like that.
Well, that's, I learned something.
Maybe it's an homage.
Thank you.
Okay, the last questions today. No last questions? This was the last questions? The last question?
Are there any films you don't like?
Oh, yes.
How you relate to them?
Mostly I just ignore them. I mean, maybe I can use a very recent example and warn you about a film. Which is playing here now, as far as I recall. Beetlejuice?
Yeah.
I love them. I should say, I love the first film. It's hilarious. I watched it many times. I was expecting this to be funny. It's not. It's very unpleasant, actually. I mean, the first one is fun. This one is not. I walked out. I almost never walk. So yes, there are films. As I say, I don't walk out very often. And there are other films I don't like. I think some of the Hong Kong action films that they've really shown. He'll watch anything from Hong Kong. So I didn't actually hate them, but it was just sort of I do like most of the films that we show.
There was a question about donations. Yeah?
I was just wondering if did you ever do like a crossover between your passions for film and Egyptology?
No, I try to keep them completely separate. There are people who look at what they call Egyptomania, which is doing things, designing buildings that look like Inquisition pylons and things like that. And there's a huge amount of scholarly interest in this, oddly enough. People collect, actual Egyptologists collect material like this, the cups and figurines and so on. But I've never felt any temptation to have Egypt in the cinema, ancient Egypt in the cinema as a topic for me to write about. Except, I suppose once I did a blog entry on, what is it?
Hand of the Pharaoh?
No, it was Gods and Men, I think it's called. Gods and Men.
Gods and Men, the Ridley Scott thing.
Yeah.
From 2014?
Yeah.
Francis, Moses.
Yeah. Well, I was very tempted to write about many mistakes in that film. And I did. It was probably a bad idea, but just too ludicrous. Yeah. Ramsey's wearing a queen's crown, for example.
Was there a reason that you wanted to keep the two separate?
Well, I'm not much interested in the whole thing of such and such in the cinema. I don't write about that kind of thing. But I have very specific interests in ancient Egypt. I study only one period, and it has been represented in the cinema, but again, it would just be complaining really much of the time. So I leave it to others.
Thank you.
That's it. One more question, one last question.
There seem to be films that are musicals but are not marketized as such recently. What do you think about that, and do you think they will have a comeback in the next years?
Can you give me an example? Something like Joker 2?
No, yeah, exactly. It was not marketized, at least in the trailer. It was not, even if it had Lady Gaga, it did not seem like it would be a musical, and it actually was, which disappointed a bit the audience, I think. What do you think about that? What's your opinion on it?
Well, I hope that that's a sort of unusual example, but I don't think anybody who saw Lady Gaga in the credits was a musical.
For instance, there was Wonka, which was a musical actually, but it was not marketized as one.
I suppose it's partly because there are a lot of people who don't like musicals, and that maybe they would take their child to the Wonka film. I didn't like it, but it was okay. I guess there are some people who complain. It does seem a little odd, but I think producers think that people don't like musicals anymore.
But they still somehow decide to make them into musicals and not actually tell the audience, and maybe even anger them more.
Well, it's possible. As I say, I guess there will seem more people will like it than not. But Joker 2 did not do well, so the audience scores online seem very low.
Thank you.
Okay, so tomorrow we will have another occasion to discuss with Kristin Thompson, but in a more informal way. So if you didn't get to ask a question today, to address something, you have another chance tomorrow at 3 at Kartulest in Geneva. There, don't expect something like this. It will be, you will be able to drink a coffee or more informal. Yeah? So you will be without that, let's say. So thank you very much.
Let's also point out that Lady Windermere's band is playing tonight at 6:30. That's a very, very hard film to see. So I would advise you to take this chance if you have any interest at all.
This is actually why we have to cut. I didn't finish the discussion because we have to go to the screening. It starts at 6:30 at the Vico Vesco. So it's not very far, you can walk if you don't have a car. Kristin Thompson will also be there after the screening to, of course, to discuss with the audience about the film. I'm also happy to announce in premiere that this, starting from January, we will dedicate the perspective to the Swedish of the Cinematheque in Lent, of the Romanian Cinematheque, to their program with the master students from archive, master degree, but also from other departments and some colleagues. So I'm really happy that the film tonight will give you a hint. Of course, it's one of his greatest masterpieces, so I don't expect that level all the time, but it's always good. So thank you very much, Mr. Thompson. It was a real pleasure and a dream come true to be able to be part of this. And thank you very much to my colleagues who made possible during your coming here, and especially to Doro, who is also here. It's really great to help us. Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to thank you as well for coming. It's good.